The Bremen Town Musicians. There was once a donkey who'd served his master well for many long years, but now he was getting tired and too old for work.
"You're not much use to me now, old-timer. I'll have to get rid of you soon, I will."
The old donkey didn't like the sound of that at all. So one day, when the farmer left the gate open, he trotted out onto the road and kept on going. He brayed, sniffing his first taste of freedom.
"I know what I'll do. I'll go to the town of Bremen and become a musician. I've always had a wonderful voice."
The donkey hadn't gone very far when he saw a dog lying on the road, howling.
"My master says I'm too old to go hunting anymore. Now what will become of me?"
The donkey knew exactly how the dog felt, so he invited him to come along too.
"With a fine voice like yours, we can be musicians together."
The dog happily agreed, and off they went towards Bremen. A little further down the road they met a cat with a face as sad as 3 rainy days.
"My mistress sent me away because I'm too old to catch mice. What shall I do now?"
The donkey told the cat she was welcome to come with them.
"With your sweet voice, we'll be the talk of the town."
So off the 3 went towards Bremen. Even further along the road they met a rooster crowing miserably.
"I'm so old, the master wants to put me in the soup. What am I going to cock-a-doodle-do?"
Naturally, the donkey invited the rooster to join them.
"After all, you have the strongest voice of all of us."
So the 4 animals set off towards Bremen. After traveling all day, night began to fall, and they were still a long way from town. The rooster flew up into a tree and spied a little house hidden in the forest. The animals headed towards it. When they reached the house, the donkey peered through the window. Inside, 3 shadowy figures were feasting in the lamplight. The donkey didn't know it, but the men were robbers, and this was their secret hideout. Sniffing the food, the hungry animals decided it was time to give their very first concert.
"When the men hear our singing, they'll give us a free meal for sure."
The donkey put his front legs on the windowsill. The dog climbed on top of the donkey. The cat climbed on top of the dog, and the rooster climbed on top of the cat. Teetering precariously, they began their performance. Hearing the dreadful din, the robbers thought there was some terrible monster outside. Then the animals started to topple and they fell in through the window. The robbers didn't wait to see who or what was attacking them. They ran for their lives. This wasn't quite the reaction the musicians had been hoping for, that the men had left all their food behind.
"Oh, they must have liked our show. They left all this food for us."
The animals ate until they were bursting. Eventually, feeling wonderfully satisfied, they settled down to the sweetest of sleeps. Meanwhile, out in the cold forest, the robbers were having second thoughts about abandoning their cozy hideout. They decided to send a scout back to see what was happening.
"Me? Why me?"
"Go on."
Nervously, the robber crept back into the dark house. Seeing the cat's eyes glowing beside the fireplace, he thought they were burning coals and tried to light a match on them. But the cat didn't like having her eyes poked and scratched him. The robber jumped back right onto the tail of the dog, which bit him. Staggering sideways, he reached out to steady himself and pulled the donkey's tail. Whack! The donkey kicked him right across the room to the rooster, who screeched in his ear. The startled robber fled as fast as his legs could carry him. When he reached the others, he told them he'd barely escaped with his life.
"First a witch scratched me, then a lion bit me, then a monster hit me with a club."
The other robbers cringed in fear.
Worst of all, though, a horrible red-eyed demon screamed the most terrifying scream I've ever heard.
Hearing that, the robbers took off and never returned to the house again. But the animals settled in comfortably and are still living there to this day, practicing their music. They're still hoping to go to Bremen. One day, they might even get there.
The Ugly Duckling. Once upon a time on a country farm, a mother duck was sitting on a batch of 7 new eggs waiting for them to hatch. Soon out popped 6 ducklings, little fluffy balls of yellow down on top of tiny webbed feet. The mother duck was delighted and thought her new ducklings were the most beautiful creatures in all creation. But she was also worried. The 7th egg, the biggest egg of all, had still not hatched. She nudged it and poked it, but nothing stirred. Then finally, a beak broke through the shell. The other ducklings gathered around excitedly to watch. But their excitement soon turned to astonishment when out of the egg stumbled the strangest looking duckling they had ever seen. Instead of yellow feathers, it had grey, and as for its feet, they were hopelessly big and floppy. It truly was a very ugly duckling. The mother duck was alarmed. Was this really her baby? She decided that it must be, and so, even though it was ugly, she tried to love it just as much as her other ducklings. The next day, the mother duck led her family down to the pond. One by one, the ducklings plopped into the water and began to swim. The ugly duckling swam too, thrilled with the pleasure of gliding across the water. On the shore, the other farm birds had gathered to inspect the new arrivals. They were more than a little surprised by what they saw.
Just have a look at that ugly duckling, would you?
From that moment on, everyone in the farmyard was mean to the little duckling because of his looks. They laughed at his big webbed feet and jeered at his clumsy grey body. His brothers and sisters bit him. The chickens pecked him. The other birds simply ignored him. The mother duck wanted to comfort him, but she was so busy looking after all the other ducklings that she had no time. So the poor ugly duckling huddled in a dark corner alone.
Nobody likes me. Why do I look so different?
He looked out at the meadows that stretched far away, further than he could see. Perhaps somewhere out there was someone who'd be his friend. Early next morning, the ugly duckling set off from the farmyard on his big webbed feet. Across the meadows he went, out into the big wide world. Eventually he reached a marsh where the wild ducks lived.
What sort of funny-looking creature are you? I'm a farm duck.
The wild duck simply laughed at him and flew away. The ugly duckling sighed, but he wasn't about to give up yet. He knew that somewhere out there was a place where he could belong. There must be. Soon his travels brought him to a tumble-down cottage. The old woman who lived there couldn't see very well. She thought he was a goose. She grabbed the duckling and shoved him in a cage.
You lay plenty of goose eggs for me to eat.
Of course, the ugly duckling didn't lay a single goose egg because he wasn't a goose. This made the old woman extremely cross, so she decided to cook him in a pot for her dinner. The ugly duckling was very scared, but he was also smart. So when the old woman opened the cage, he shot between her legs and escaped into the night. The next day, he found himself on the shore of a vast lake. He hid in the reeds, lonely and afraid. He wondered if anyone would ever like him. In the sky above, a flock of the most beautiful birds he'd ever seen passed overhead. They were white swans with long, slender necks and great, graceful wings. As he watched them fly off into the distance, he wished with all his heart that he looked like them. Winter came and the lake froze over. The poor duckling huddled deep in the reeds, shivering. Luckily, a kind farmer found him and took him to shelter in his barn. It was warm and safe there, and at least the cows and horses didn't laugh at him. So when spring eventually returned, he headed towards the lake, hoping that this time he might find a friend. As he arrived at the water's edge, he heard a familiar sound. It was the flock of swans returning from their winter journey. The ugly duckling watched them in admiration. Then as he turned away, a miracle happened. On the surface of the water, he saw his own reflection. To his amazement, he was no longer an ugly duckling. He'd changed into a swan, a beautiful young swan. The other swans flew down to join him. They were delighted to find a new arrival and asked if he'd be their friend. The young bird was thrilled. Of course he would! He followed the others into the lake and proudly glided across the water. The young swan almost burst with happiness. At last he had found where he truly belonged.
The Golden Goose. There were once 3 brothers who were very different from each other. The eldest was smart, the second eldest was strong, and the youngest was, Peter. Everyone thought that Peter was a fool. His mother sighed, "Whatever shall become of him?" His brothers sniggered, "There's always a job as the village idiot." But Peter had a good heart and a twinkle in his eye. One day the smart son was sent out to cut wood for the fire. So his mother packed him a large and delicious lunch. As he entered the forest, the little old man appeared.
"Good day, lad. Can you spare me a bite to eat? I'm terribly hungry."
But the boy was far too clever to share. "If I give you any, there won't be as much for me. Be off." The eldest son started to cut down a tree, but on his first blow the axe glanced and hit his leg. He ran home howling and vowed that woodcutting was far too dangerous for someone of his intelligence. Next morning, the strong son strode into the forest, also with a tasty lunch his mother had packed. Once again, the little old man appeared.
"I'm so very hungry. Can you spare me a morsel of food, lad?"
The boy just laughed.
What do you take me for? Get your own lunch, Grandpa.
Then, as he began to chop wood, the axe bounced back and hit him on the head. He stumbled home in a daze, telling everyone he was much too strong to waste time on stupid things like tree felling. The next morning, Peter was sent into the forest. For his lunch, his mother had packed only a few crusts of stale bread. Once more, the little man appeared.
"Can you spare me a bite to eat, lad?"
Peter didn't mind.
Well, it isn't much, but I'm happy to share it.
As soon as the old man touched the food, it turned into a magnificent feast with plenty for both of them.
Will you look at that? This lunch isn't half bad, is it?
When they'd eaten their fill, the old man said,
"Since you were so kind, I'll return the favour. Cut down that old tree, and you'll find something very special underneath."
and with that he vanished. Peter set to work and chopped vigorously. Soon the old tree fell. To his astonishment, there in a hollow under the roots he found a goose with feathers of purest gold.
Now there's something you don't see every day.
With the golden goose tucked under one arm, Peter headed for the city. But along the way he stopped at an inn. The innkeeper had 3 daughters, and when they saw the goose, they just had to have a golden feather for themselves. The eldest daughter snuck up behind Peter and reached out to pluck a feather. But as soon as she touched the goose, she was stuck fast. No matter how much she struggled, she couldn't let go. Her sisters tried to pull her free, but when they touched her, they were stuck too. Peter left the inn and went on his way, whistling cheerily. Taking no notice of the 3 girls trailing along behind him, they passed a church where the parson spotted them.
"Girls, girls, you should be ashamed of yourselves running after a young man like that."
The parson tried to pull the girls away, but the moment he touched them, he was stuck as well. The church clerk saw the parson and could hardly believe his eyes.
Your Reverence, why are you playing such childish games?
The clerk grabbed the parson, and of course, he couldn't let go either. Finally, 2 passing labourers tried to help, but they too were forced to join the procession. Still, Peter kept whistling, oblivious to the 7 people being dragged with him towards the city. Now, in that city lived a princess who took life so seriously that she hardly ever smiled and never ever laughed. Her father, the king, had announced that any man who was able to make her laugh should have her for his wife. The princess was out on the balcony when Peter arrived. She stared, astonished to see the strange procession. Peter looked up and smiled.
Lovely day for a stroll, isn't it, Your Highness?
The princess looked into his twinkling eyes and started to smile. Then she giggled. And soon she burst into long, loud laughter. Peter married the princess the very next day. And, as people do when they share a sense of humor, they lived merrily ever after.
The Princess and the Pea. Long ago and far away there once lived a prince. He was dashing and handsome, with a fine cloak and a shiny steed, and a kingdom full of loyal subjects who cheered him wherever he went. But for all of this, the prince was sad. He couldn't help thinking that there was something missing from his life. Then one morning it hit him.
That's it. What's the one thing every prince needs?
A cloak?
No,
A steed?
I have one.
Loyal subjects.
Not even close. I need a princess.
With that single thought humming in his head, he went to see his mother, the Queen, and announce his plan.
I shall travel to the 4 corners of the globe to find a princess.
The Queen, who was something of an expert on princesses, having been one herself, had one piece of advice for her son.
Just make sure she's a real princess. There are plenty of fake ones out there.
So with the Queen's words of warning ringing in his ears, the prince set off to find a princess. And find them he did. He found them everywhere, in castles and palaces, bewitched by witches and imprisoned by dragons. But in every case, there was always something about them that wasn't quite right. And so it was with a heavy heart that the prince finally returned home, alone. The Queen tried her best to comfort him.
Cheer up. You know what they say. A son always has his mother.
But nothing she said made the prince feel better. He just sat around the palace feeling sorry for himself. He never wore his fine cloak, and he hardly ever rode his steed. He didn't even care if anyone cheered anymore. All he wanted was a princess, a real princess. Then one dark and stormy night, as the lightning flashed and the rain swept down, there was a knock at the castle door.
I see you had the bell fixed while I was away.
The prince hurried down and opened the door, and there stood a beautiful young woman. Her hair was all wet and dripping, her clothes were damp and muddy, and her boots were so full of water that she sloshed when she walked. But she said she was a princess.
A real princess. And I need a bed for the night.
The prince ordered the maids to bring her fresh clothes, and when she was changed and dry once more, even the Queen agreed that she most certainly looked like a princess.
But is she a real princess?
The prince had no doubts whatsoever. He had fallen instantly in love with her, and was sure she was as real a princess as there ever could be. After all, she walked like a princess, and she talked like a princess.
The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain.
And she even played cards like a princess.
Royal flush, I win.
The Queen, however, was still not convinced.
I shall set her a test. Then we shall see how much of a princess she really is.
So the Queen crept off to the young woman's room, and there she put a pea on the wooden base of the bed. On top of that she ordered a mattress to be placed, then another, and another. 20 mattresses high she piled, and 20 eiderdowns on top of that. Naturally, the young woman was quite surprised to see her bed towered so high. But thinking it was local custom, and being the polite princess she was, she said nothing, but climbed the ladder and settled down to sleep.
Sweet dreams, child.
The next morning the Queen asked the girl how she slept.
Terribly. I hardly slept a wink. The bed was so uncomfortable I tossed and turned all night.
On hearing those words, the Queen knew at once that the girl was indeed a real princess. Only a real princess would be so delicate of feeling that something as tiny as a pea would discomfort her under all that bedding.
Honestly, I'm black and blue all over.
And so the prince and princess were married, and the whole kingdom rejoiced. And as for the pea, well, they put it on display for all the world to see. We're told it's still there to this day, unless, that is, someone's eaten it. Baba Yaga. Long ago in Russia there lived a young girl called Alana, who was the daughter of a poor farmer. Alana's father loved her dearly, but her stepmother did not. She made the girl work from dawn till dusk and scolded her for no reason at all. One day, while the farmer was away, the stepmother said to Alana,
Go off to my sister who lives in the forest and borrow a needle and thread. Be off!
Alana nodded obediently and set off. On the way, though, she went to her grandmother's to ask advice.
Dear girl, your stepmother's sister is a bony-legged witch called Baba Yaga. If you visit her, keep your wits about you, and remember to be kind to everyone you meet.
The grandmother then gave her some ham, bread, oil, and a ribbon to take with her.
Use these wisely, and they will keep you safe.
Alana headed into the dark forest. After a long walk, she came to a hut that stood on chicken legs. Peering through the window was the bony old witch, Baba Yaga. Alana called to her bravely.
Hello, dear step-aunt. I'm here to borrow a needle and thread.
Baba Yaga smiled, which was not a pretty sight.
All right, my darling. But first, sit down and do some weaving for me.
Alana sat down and started to weave. Baba Yaga croaked softly to her maid.
Fetch some water for a bath. I want her clean before I eat her.
When the girl heard this, she was terrified, but she kept her head. As Baba Yaga left, she whispered to the maid,
Why don't you fetch the water in a sieve instead of a bucket?
And she gave the maid her handkerchief as a gift. From inside the house, Baba Yaga called out,
Are you washing, girl? Yes, dear step-aunt.
Alana noticed a skinny cat, so she threw the ham to it.
Cat, is there any way to escape?
The cat ate up the ham hungrily, then gave the girl a comb and a towel.
Take these and run away. Baba Yaga will chase you, but when she gets close, throw down the towel. If she catches up again, throw down the comb.
Alana took the comb and towel and ran. Baba Yaga's dogs started barking, so she threw them her grandmother's bread. The dogs let her pass. As she got to the entrance, Baba Yaga's gates tried to close on her. Alana poured grandmother's oil on their squeaky hinges, and they let her through. Baba Yaga's birch tree tried to scratch her face, so she tied grandmother's ribbon around it. The tree saw its reflection in a puddle and was delighted with how pretty it looked, so it let Alana pass. Back at the house, the cat was weaving and making a terrible mess of it.
Are you still washing, girl? Of course, my dearest darling step-aunt.
Baba Yaga instantly ran outside and saw Ilana was gone. She yelled at the cat.
Fool! Why didn't you stop her?
I've served you for years, and you never gave me a scrap. She gave me ham. Furious, Baba Yaga ran towards the gates. She screeched at the dogs, the gates, the birch tree, and the maid.
Idiots! Why didn't you stop her?
The maid spoke on behalf of all of them.
We've served you for years, and you never gave us anything. But Ilana was kind to us.
Baba Yaga cursed and jumped into her mortar bowl. She raced off after the girl, using the pestle as a rudder and a broom to sweep her trail. Up ahead, Alana put her ear to the ground and heard Baba Yaga getting closer and closer. Quickly she threw down the towel, and instantly it turned into a wide river. The girl ran on. When Baba Yaga reached the river, she fumed. She waved to her bulls, and the beasts lowered their great heads into the river and drank it dry. Baba Yaga set off once more. Again, Alana heard the old witch getting closer. She threw down the comb. Instantly, it turned into an impenetrable forest. Alana turned and ran as fast as her little legs could carry her. When Baba Yaga reached the forest, she shrieked with rage. She tried to gnaw through the trees with her teeth, but even Baba Yaga's teeth weren't that sharp. Cursing and fuming, she gave up, knowing she'd been beaten by a mere girl. Alana arrived home safely, where she found her father had returned. When he heard his daughter's story, he was so horrified that he sent the stepmother away forever. From that time on, he looked after Alana like the precious jewel she was. Brave Tin Soldier. In a little boy's bedroom there once stood 25 tin soldiers. In their bright red and blue uniforms they all looked exactly alike, except for the last. Alas, There hadn't been enough tin to finish him, so he had only one leg. But as you know, a soldier who can stand straight on one leg alone is a very special soldier indeed. There were other toys on the table where the tin soldiers stood. Among them stood the prettiest paper girl you've ever seen. She was a dancer who stretched her arms out wide and stood on one leg. Yes, just like the tin soldier. One night, as the other toys played under the moonlight, the tin soldier waited for the pretty dancer to start her show. Then, as the clock struck 12, she spun around gracefully on her tiny stage. The tin soldier was entranced.
How I wish that one day I might marry her.
But the pretty dancer had another admirer, an evil goblin who lived inside the Jack-in-the-Box. He wanted her for his bride too.
Some wishes aren't meant for scruffy tin soldiers.
The tin soldier pretended not to hear the goblin.
Just you wait, boy. You'll see.
The next morning, as the light crept over the rooftops, the goblin conjured up a gust of wind. The pretty dancer gasped in horror as she saw the tin soldier struggle to keep his balance. Then he lurched and tumbled straight out of the window and into the street below. The poor soldier found himself face down in the gutter as it started to rain. Two boys saw him. They made the soldier a boat out of newspaper. They sailed him down the gutter. The wind and rain made enormous waves. The brave soldier clung desperately to the sides. But worse was still to come. Up ahead lay a dark and filthy drain, guarded by a foul and ugly water rat.
No money, no entry.
Of course the soldier had no money. He quickly steered around the rat, who growled angrily and lunged at the boat.
You won't get away with this.
The soldier closed his ears and kept his gaze straight ahead as the boat rushed headlong through the murky torrents. Soon he came to the end of the tunnel, and the soldier smiled as the sun's rays cut through the clouds. Then, suddenly, he found himself hurtling over the edge of the biggest waterfall he could ever imagine. The drain emptied straight into a deep canal. The boat twirled round and round, and the brave soldier held on with all his might. Then a huge wave smashed into the boat and cut it clean in half. With nothing left to cling to, the soldier began to sink. He closed his eyes, and a tear came to them as he thought of the pretty dancer, and knew he'd never see her again. Then an extraordinary thing happened. A big old fish appeared, and in one gulp swallowed the soldier whole. But even more extraordinary, the fish was then netted by a fisherman who put him up for sale at the local market. And most extraordinary of all, the fish was bought by the mother of the little boy who owned the tin soldiers. When the woman cut the fish open, she peered into its belly and stared in amazement, for there was the tin soldier, and he was standing as steady as ever. You can imagine how amazed the other toys were when the tin soldier was placed back in their company. They were full of admiration for his wonderful bravery. But no one was more in admiration or more delighted than the pretty dancer. She looked at him and smiled the most beautiful smile he had ever seen. Unfortunately, the terrible goblin also saw her smile. He flew into a rage and conjured up an even bigger gust of wind. In an instant, the tin soldier was sent tumbling over and down and into the stove. The heat was intense, and soon the colours in the soldier's uniform began to fade, and his poor body started to melt.
Taught you a lesson. You won't get away this time.
But the goblin's laugh didn't last long, because that very same wind lifted up the pretty dancer and swept her into the stove too. The soldier gasped as he saw her catch a light, and before he could move to help, she was gone. The next day, when the maid cleaned out the ashes, all that was left of the pretty little dancer was a tinsel rose burned black as a cinder. And of the brave tin soldier, only a melted lump remained, shaped like a tiny heart.
The Fly. In the countryside of Vietnam, a peasant boy named Lan lived with his family in their tiny house. They had a little land and grew a little food, and life was hard. Not far from Lan's village lived Hung, a very rich man with a very large house. The poor farmers would often come to Hung to borrow money. He was happy to hand out the cash, but if their crops failed or animals grew sick and they couldn't pay him back, then Hung would pounce, taking everything they owned for himself. One day, just as Lan was setting out to work in the fields, he found Hung standing in their yard, looking over the simple house of timber and straw. Lan knew his parents owed this man a lot of money, and his visit was not a good sign.
Boy, are your parents at home? My father is out cutting living trees and planting dead ones. My mother is selling the wind and buying the moon. That's very interesting. But what are they doing, really? Can't you work it out? It's simple. Father is on the Emerald Hill, cutting living trees and planting dead ones. Mother is in the harbour city, selling the wind and buying the moon. The rich man became irritated, but Hung was desperate to know what the boy's riddle really meant.
All right then. If you tell me the meaning of what you say, I will wipe out your family's debt to me, as heaven and earth are my witnesses.
Heaven and earth are blind and deaf. We should have a living witness.
Hung was about to really lose his temper, but just then he saw a small fly come to rest on a nearby woodpile. Hung smiled and pointed.
That fly is living. It can be our witness.
Lan looked at the fly. It was indeed a living thing, so, true to his word, he explained himself.
My father is cutting down bamboo stalks and putting them in the ground to make a fence. The tree is alive when he cuts it and dead when he puts it back in the earth. My mother is selling fans at the market so she can buy oil for our lamps. Fans make a wind to cool you, and oil fuels our lamp so it can shine like the moon.
The explanation was so simple he was annoyed that he hadn't thought of it himself.
Now I have explained everything, and my family's debt to you is cleared. Thank you.
Impudent boy.
A few days later, Lan arrived home and was shocked to see Hung back in the yard clutching the family pig in his arms. As well, one of Hung's servants was leading their cow away. Lan's mother and father were in despair. Hung was taking everything they owned, claiming the family still owed him money. Lan was furious. Hung had promised to leave them alone, but here he was taking their home and their animals. Lan threw himself in front of the rich man.
But the debt is gone. You promised me last week. Oh, I never said anything of the sort. Out of my way, boy.
Lan angrily pulled his pig from Hung's grasp. His father shut the gate, stopping Hung's servant marching out with their cow. Lan's mother overturned a cart that had been loaded with their furniture. Now it was Hung's turn to be angry.
We'll see what the magistrate says about this.
Next morning, all the villagers gathered in the square. No one had dared challenge Hung before. As Lan told the magistrate his story, they wondered what Hung would say in reply. But Hung just sneered.
It's complete rubbish. The boy's making it all up.
The magistrate scratched his head, wondering what to do.
Without a witness, I cannot tell which of you is lying.
But there was a witness. A fly heard the promise. Truly. Oh, please, a fly. There was no fly. How could you forget? It was sitting right on the end of your nose.
Ha ha ha! Liar! The fly was sitting on a pile of wood.
Hung froze. The crowd was silent. Everyone turned to the magistrate.
So, there was a fly. If you lied about the fly, Hung, then you must have lied about the promise, too. The debt is wiped.
They raised Lan onto their shoulders and carried him in triumph through the town. Hung, meanwhile, slunk away like the thief that he was. And that is how a poor peasant boy became a hero. All because of a little fly.
Little Red Riding Hood. In a small village that stood by the edge of a wood lived a young girl known as Little Red Riding Hood. She was called this because she loved her red hood and wore it everywhere, even when she went to sleep. One day her mother handed Little Red Riding Hood a basket of freshly baked bread to take to her sick grandmother who lived on the other side of the forest. She looked her daughter straight in the eye and made Little Red Riding Hood promise one thing. Be sure to stay on the path all the way to Grandmother's house. Little Red Riding Hood smiled and nodded. Then she kissed her mother farewell and set out on her journey. As she skipped through the forest singing merrily to herself, Little Red Riding Hood didn't see the pair of dark, cold eyes that watched her from behind the trees, nor could she hear the sound of the soft padded feet that followed her quietly through the forest. So as she came round a bend, it was quite a surprise when a large wolf jumped out in front of her.
Off to visit someone?
My grandmother is sick.
Dear me, how dreadful.
The wolf's teeth glistened in the sun as he leaned towards Red Riding Hood and smiled slyly.
A poor sick grandmother needs flowers to warm her heart.
But I didn't bring any.
There's plenty out in the forest. Why don't you pick some there?
But Little Red Riding Hood remembered her mother's warning never to leave the path, so she said goodbye to the wolf and continued on her way. Soon after, though, she saw her grandmother's favourite flowers growing just off to one side of the path. They weren't very deep in the forest, and they would make such a lovely gift for her grandmother. I'll just quickly pick a few. And so she left the path and went into the forest to collect some. The cunning wolf saw this and set off. He ran straight to the grandmother's house where he knocked on the door.
Who's there?
Little Red Riding Hood with a basket of bread.
The old woman was delighted that her granddaughter was visiting.
Just lift the latch and come in.
The wolf smiled. He let himself in and in moments had gobbled her up. He then quickly dressed himself in the grandmother's nightclothes and cap. He drew the curtains, jumped into her bed and lay waiting. It wasn't long before Little Red Riding Hood arrived at the front door with her beautiful bunch of flowers. She knocked on the door.
Grandmother?
I'm here.
Little Red Riding Hood stepped back with surprise. That voice didn't sound like her grandmother at all.
Has your cold given you a sore throat, Grandmother?
Yes, dear. So just lift the latch and come in.
Little Red Riding Hood made her way into the darkened bedroom and pulled back the curtains. She peered at the figure in the bed.
Grandmother, what big ears you have.
All the better to hear you with.
She stepped further in and looked a little closer.
Grandmother, what big hands you have.
All the better to hug you with.
Little Red Riding Hood stepped closer again until her nose was almost touching the wolf's long snout.
Grandmother, what big teeth you have.
All the better to eat you with.
And with that, the wolf jumped out of the bed and grabbed poor Little Red Riding Hood. Within seconds, he'd gobbled her up too. The wolf staggered outside, feeling very pleased with himself.
I'm so full. I think a nice little nap is in order.
So the sleepy wolf lay down beside the house and soon was snoring loudly. Now it so happened that a woodcutter passed by soon after this. He heard the snores and knew that the old lady never snored as loudly as that. He crept around the side of the house and found the greedy wolf fast asleep. He guessed what had happened and quickly cut him open. What a sight to see! Coughing and spluttering, Grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood climbed straight out of the wolf's belly. Little Red Riding Hood quickly gathered some stones from the garden outside and filled his belly with them. Grandmother then stitched the wolf's stomach together with her needle and thread. Later, when the wolf woke, he saw the three people and tried to run away. But the stones were so heavy that after a short distance he fell down, quite dead. Little Red Riding Hood unpacked the basket of bread and laid a table. Then, with the woodcutter and her grandmother, she had a splendid afternoon tea. That evening, she said her goodbyes and set off home. This time, though, she was very careful to do exactly as her mother had said. She stayed on that path all the way home. Rapunzel. Once there was a very poor young couple who lived next door to a very rich old witch. The wife was expecting their first child, and every night she'd gaze hungrily from the window of their tumble-down cottage at all the fine food growing in the witch's magnificent gardens. Such delicious vegetables, and I am so weak with hunger. How I wish I could have some for my supper.
Now her husband knew that the witch would punish anyone she caught stealing from her garden. But one look at his poor, weak wife, and he knew he had to help her. That night, the husband crept into the witch's garden and returned with the vegetables. So delicious. Please, husband, I must have more. And so the next night, he again climbed the wall to the witch's garden. More. But on the third night, as he began to pick the vegetables, a voice chilled him to the bone.
Aha! Steal from my garden, will you?
The terrified husband pleaded for his life.
I only wish food for my wife who is expecting our child.
The witch cackled with delight.
A child, hey? Very well. Your wife will have her vegetables, but in return, the child will be mine.
The poor husband tried to protest, but his pleas were futile. And so, when the baby girl was born, the witch arrived and took her away. She locked her in a tall tower deep in the forest, which had neither stairs nor door. Years passed, and Rapunzel, for that was the girl's name, grew into a beautiful young woman with the most gloriously long hair, fine as spun gold. Every day the witch would stand beneath the tower and call,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.
And every day Rapunzel would untie her long locks and let her hair hang down from the window. Then the witch would climb up the silken tresses to Rapunzel's prison and bring her food and drink. One day, a handsome prince was riding by, and he saw the witch call out to Rapunzel. He saw her long golden hair tumble out of the tower window, and then he caught sight of Rapunzel's face and fell instantly, totally in love. The prince waited till the witch had gone, then rode up to the tower.
Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.
Thinking the witch had forgotten something, Rapunzel let down her hair. Moments later, she was amazed to see the handsome prince climb in through the window. One look at him was enough, and she too fell instantly, totally in love. Together they made plans to run away the next day and be married. But little did they know that the witch was watching from the forest nearby, and when she saw the prince climb down from the tower, her fury was terrible. She hurried to the tower and called out to Rapunzel.
Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.
She then climbed up to confront the girl.
Betray me, will you? I'll make you wish you'd never been born.
And with that, the witch pulled out her scissors and... in a trice, Rapunzel's beautiful golden locks lay on the floor. The witch then banished the girl into the wilderness. Next day, when the prince arrived to take Rapunzel away, the wicked witch was waiting for him up in the tower.
Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.
The witch threw down Rapunzel's hair, which she had tied to the bed, and waited while the prince climbed up. When the prince saw the witch, he was horrified.
Where is my love?
Rapunzel is gone. You'll never see her again.
With that, the witch cast the prince from the tower. He fell to the ground and was blinded by the thorns below. Broken in heart and spirit, the prince wandered blindly for many months, not knowing or caring where he went. Then one day, he heard a woman's voice singing a song of lost love. It had to be
Rapunzel.
He called her name, and she ran to him, took him tenderly in her arms, and cried tears of joy to see her true love once more. To their astonishment, when her tears touched his poor eyes, he found that he could see again. The prince and Rapunzel rode away to his castle. There they married, and she became his princess. They lived together happily for the rest of their days, knowing that their love was stronger than any witch's spell could ever be. The Buried Moon. Long ago in Old England, a small village sat on the edge of a moor. Now when the moon was full, the moors were safe to cross, the bright moonlight illuminating the paths as clearly as if it was day. But as the month wore on and the moon grew thinner, folk quickened their steps, anxiously looking around to see what might lie skulking in the shadows. And on the night with no moon, none dared cross at all. For that's when people believed many dark creatures appeared, crawling horrors, climbing vapors, creeping bogies, and things. Now the moon heard talk of this and decided to take a look for herself. She pulled a handful of black sky and fashioned it about her like a cloak. Then she floated silently down onto the moors. The moon crept along the sodden path. It was dark, to be sure, and eerie, no question. But she saw no crawling horrors, no bogies, no things intent upon mischief. Then, just as she was about to go, she stumbled into a deep pool of black water. Frightened, she flailed about and clutched at some nearby vines. But as soon as she touched them, they sprang to life, and a great snag curled around her limbs, tight as handcuffs. The moon wrestled and writhed, but the snag held her fast. As she lay exhausted in the stinking bog, a voice cried out. A traveller who had tried to brave the moors had become hopelessly lost. Full of fear, he strayed further and further from the path. The moon's heart ached. Arching her back, she managed to push back her hood just enough for a beam of light to shoot out and flood the path. So desperate was the man to escape, he bolted away without a single thought for his rescuer. Then, out of the shadows came the creeping things, dark and formless and full of glee at their fine catch. Long had they tired of the moon spoiling their fun with her light. They hatched a plan. Gathering all their strength, they rolled a huge rectangular stone on top of the moon, trapping her for good. The next day, villagers worked long into the afternoon, counting on the moon's return to show them the way home. But the moon didn't appear that night, or the next night, or the next. Those who failed to leave early enough to travel home across the moors turned back, preferring to stay the night at the inn than chance what might lie in the darkness. And so it was, month after month. Every night the moors were pitch black and no one was able to cross. Then one night, that very same traveller who'd been saved by the moon passed back through the village. He heard the sad talk of the missing moon and told them of the fateful night he lost his way on the moors. The villagers consulted the wise woman of the mill. She stirred her ancient brewpot and gazed into her magic mirror.
Everyone must go back into the moors. All of ye must carry a hazel twig for protection and a stone in your mouth. You mustn't speak a word till you're home again. Safe.
She told them once they'd seen a cross, a candle, and a coffin, the moon would be returned. The villagers gathered twigs and stones. None of them fancied going into the moors that night, but for all the times the moon had kept them safe, they owed her this much. It was dark as ebony on the marshy moors. The waters gurgled. The vapours sat cold upon their shoulders. Fingery twigs clutched at their legs, but they remembered the wise woman's warning and spoke not a word. By and by they came close to the great black pool. There they saw the branches of a naked tree, arms outstretched like a cross. A single star flickered in the pool like a candle. And there the great rectangular stone sat, just like a coffin, weak moonbeams seeping from its edges. This was it. They'd found the moon. With all their strength they rolled the stone away. For the briefest moment they saw a pale, beautiful face. Then suddenly they were all blinded by a blanket of white light. When they looked up, there was the moon, back in her rightful place. And to this day, except for her one night of rest, that's where she remains, stealing into every corner, driving the creatures of the darkness away, and keeping the moors safe for all to travel.
Giant's Stairs. Long ago, on a rocky island off the Irish coast, there lived a most fearsome giant. The giant carved enormous stairs, each the height of a house, all the way up the steep hills. And, right at the very top, shrouded in clouds, he built his castle. At least, that's what the villagers on the mainland said. In actual fact, none of them had ever seen the castle, or the giant, for that matter. They steered their boats well clear of the island's shores, and none were brave enough to climb those stairs for fear of what they'd find. One day, a boy from the village was out riding. He'd long been warned to stay clear of the cliffs which ran close to the giant's home. Before he knew it, he stood high on the cliffs at the closest point to the island. And just as he was wondering what lay beyond the mists, there was a great rumbling, and a giant shadow fell across him, and he was never heard of again. In the village lived a blacksmith who, from time to time, had dreams which came true. Most times they told him things like he dropped his keys down the grate near the fire. But one year after the young boy's disappearance, the blacksmith dreamed himself a most extraordinary dream. In it, the young boy appeared sitting astride his white horse. He told the blacksmith he was held captive in the giant's castle and begged him to come and rescue him. The blacksmith could think of many things he'd rather do than break into a giant's castle. "How do I know this is true and not just a trick of my mind?"
I will leave you a token.
Suddenly his horse struck out with its hooves. Then everything went black. In the morning, the blacksmith woke to find a nail from the horse's shoe beneath his pillow and a bruise, the shape of a horseshoe, right in the middle of his forehead. Later that day, the blacksmith found himself down at the harbor, staring out at the island and the enormous giant stairs. "I'm mad, running off half-cocked on the strength of a dream." The sun slipped from view as the blacksmith tied his tiny boat to a rock. Before him loomed the giant's steps. They looked impossible to climb, but he knew he had to try. He heaved and moaned and heaved some more. It was close to midnight before he lurched over the last step and found himself at the edge of the mist that hid the giant's castle. He took a deep breath and stepped into the cloud. Fumbling his way through, he eventually came to the other side, where he was confronted by a large black door. As if it sensed him, the door creaked open to let him in. The blacksmith cautiously stepped inside. A long, dark corridor lay ahead. Tiny flames lit the way. The blacksmith crept forward. He soon came to another door. Before he knew it, the door flew open, and before him stood the giant himself. He was a fearsome creature, and behind him stood guards who appeared to be neither man nor beast.
"Who interrupts my evening meal?"
I am the bravest man in all of Ireland, and I am here to rescue the boy you kidnapped 1 year ago.
Very well. Bring out the boys.
The guards sprang to life. They pulled back an enormous door, and suddenly a young boy on a white horse rode out. And then another, and another, and another, until 8 identical young boys on 8 identical white horses stood before the blacksmith.
If you choose the right boy without asking a single question, you are free to go. But if you choose wrongly, you pay with your life.
The blacksmith gulped. He pushed his hands into his pockets to stop them shaking. And there he felt the nail the horse left under his pillow when he kicked him in his dream. And then he had an idea. He peered at the first horse's hooves. Every nail was intact. He looked again at the second, the third, the fourth. The giant grew tired of the game.
Enough, blacksmith. Make your choice.
The blacksmith reached out to look at one more hoof. There it was, the space for the missing nail.
This is the boy.
The giant was bound to keep his promise, and soon after, the blacksmith, the boy, and his white horse were safely back in a boat on their way to the mainland. But from that day on, no boy ever again rode out to that cliff top, and no one ever climbed those giant stairs again.
Haughty Princess. Long, long ago, there was a wise and good king who had a daughter, a very beautiful princess. Every day the princess would dress in her finest gowns and most expensive jewels and parade around the palace for all to admire.
Am I not the richest, most beautiful princess in all the land?
Oh, yes. Without doubt. Absolute knockout.
One day, the king summoned the princess.
Daughter, it's time for you to choose a husband.
The princess's great beauty was famous throughout the land, and in no time at all, princes and noblemen were queuing at the palace gate to ask for her hand in marriage. The proud princess, however, was very hard to please.
Oh no, you'll never do, Prince Barrelbelly. You're much too fat. And you're too thin, Duke Stringbean.
And so she scoffed down the long line of suitors. Too old, too short, too tall, too hairy, too bald.
And you, Prince Pointybeard,
she said to a fine bearded gentleman at the end of the queue,
you are much too plain and ordinary to marry me.
When the good king saw the princess ridicule her suitors so, he became very cross indeed.
Daughter, you shall marry the very next man who knocks upon our door.
The princess immediately threw a tantrum.
No! I won't! I won't! I won't!
But the king was adamant.
The very next man.
Early the next day, a knock was heard at the palace gates. A poor peddler with a thick and bushy beard had arrived.
Long and short, big and small, brooms, brooms, I sell 'em all.
And so it was that the beautiful princess met her husband, a poor and humble broom seller. The king was delighted that at last his daughter was married.
Oh, happy day!
The princess, however, was misery itself.
Oh, misery is mine!
Very happy to have such a beautiful wife, the broom seller hoisted her upon his cart, and they trotted off out the palace gate. For days they bumped and rattled up hill and down dale. Eventually they passed a magnificent castle with glorious gardens and a sparkling lake.
To whom does that splendid castle belong?
Asked the princess forlornly.
Why, Prince Pointybeard, of course. If you'd married him, it would be all yours now.
Woe is me! If only I'd not been so cruel to him.
At last they drew up outside a tiny cottage.
What a miserable hovel! Who could possibly live here?
The princess asked.
Me! And now it's your house too.
Every day the princess had to light the fire, cook the food and mop the floor. And every night she'd flop into her bed of straw and cry.
My life is utter misery. If only I'd married Prince Pointybeard.
Hush your complaints.
The broom seller cried one day.
You're off to the castle. The king's son is to be married, and there's much to prepare.
At the castle, the poor princess swept and scrubbed and polished until everything in the grand ballroom sparkled like new. And when the guests arrived, they all marvelled.
Wonderful!
Amazing! Marvellous!
Then they spotted the princess in her cleaning rags.
Awful!
Ugly!
Terrible!
Oh, what a wretched creature I am! If only I'd never been so mean and nasty to everyone.
The princess cried as she ran towards the door. Before she could escape, though, the king's son appeared and gave a sweeping bow. The princess stopped in shock. The guests all gasped in horror.
Prince Pointybeard?
She stuttered.
Pointybeard to some.
He ruffled his beard so it was thick and bushy.
And humble broom seller to others.
The princess saw at once that Prince Pointybeard and the broom seller were the very same man.
Now will you be my princess?
But I was so cruel and mean to you,
cried the princess.
You have learnt your lesson. You are now indeed worthy of being a true princess.
Later that day, the beautiful princess and the handsome prince were married in a magnificent ceremony attended by everyone in the kingdom. And from that moment on, the princess made sure she was never mean or nasty to anyone ever again. Talkative Tortoise. Many years ago in a city in India, there lived a very talkative king. That man did not draw breath from dawn till dusk. He talked while he bathed.
Oh, this is lovely soup. Oh, yes,
He talked while he ate.
I could eat more of this every time I like them.
He even talked while he slept.
I was so tired. I really wasn't. No, I'm not as tired as I was the other night, but yes.
Apart from being very tiring, having a king who always talked caused other problems too. When the king walked through the palace grounds, talking to his advisors, no one could get a word in.
yes, I'll sit down.
Pardon me, sire?
Oh, yes. Oh, this is not so bad. Yes, lovely.
Pardon me, your...
For goodness sake, why didn't you say something?
Among the king's advisors was a young man who would become the future Buddha. Unlike the king's other advisors, the future Buddha did not try to interrupt the king. He simply wrote him notes instead.
And of course, no one would have thought.
At nights in the palace, while the other advisors pretended to listen to the king's long stories, the Buddha quietly prayed. He prayed for a way to help the king learn not to talk too much. And finally, after many days of prayer, his prayers were heard. Far away on the Himalayan plains lived a tortoise, which had exactly the same problem as the king. He too was overly fond of the sound of his own voice.
In the blink of an eye, I tell you true, and I tell you true, and I'll tell you till I'm blue in the face, over and over and over.
On he would go, but unlike the king, the tortoise had no one at all to listen to him. His pond was completely empty. Until one day, 2 wild ducks appeared. To the tortoise's delight, the ducks were extremely keen to hear every word he said. Many hours went by, and the ducks listened patiently.
Over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I'll be telling it to you, and I'll be telling it to you again.
Eventually, as the tortoise paused for breath, one of the ducks broke in.
Dear tortoise, much as we would love to hear again of the time you outsmarted 20 lions, we would love, more than anything, for you to agree to visit our home.
The ducks showed him a picture of where they lived, a beautiful golden cave high in the mountains. But the tortoise was worried. He was slow and old. How could he possibly get up there? The ducks had a plan. If only the tortoise could be quiet long enough to hear it. One of the ducks picked up a sturdy stick. If the tortoise could bite on the middle of it, they'd each take an end and fly him high through the air to the golden cave. The tortoise nodded his approval. It was a perfect plan, provided he could keep his mouth shut the entire journey. The tortoise bit down on the middle of the stick. The ducks flapped their wings, and slowly the trio rose up, up, up into the air. They flew high over many lakes and cities, and a multitude of things the tortoise, under normal circumstances, would have loved to chatter about. But with a stick in his mouth, he couldn't speak a word. Finally, they flew over the city of the talkative king. The king's servants looked up. They couldn't believe their eyes.
Have you ever seen such a thing?
The tortoise bristled.
A tortoise carried by 2 ducks? Has he lost his legs?
The tortoise glared. He'd tell these stupid people a thing or two.
Who do you think you are?
That was all the tortoise got out. He fell from the sky like a stone and landed right at the feet of the talkative king himself. Instantly he split in 2. The king was astounded, if not speechless. What could possibly explain such a strange occurrence? He ordered the 2 halves of the tortoise shell be brought to the great hall, and there he talked long into the night, long after his wife and servants had fallen asleep.
Why am I so tired?
Eventually, the king looked up to find only the future Buddha was awake.
I talk so much that everyone has gone to sleep. Why not you?
The king demanded.
The tortoise has given his life for a great teaching. Do you understand what it is, my lord?
The king looked at the 2 halves of the tortoise and suddenly understood.
The tortoise died because he could not hold his tongue.
The future Buddha smiled broadly and nodded. From that day on, the king became a man of much fewer words, but those words he did speak were much, much wiser.